The Arctic is no longer a frozen frontier at the edge of the world. It is rapidly becoming the geographic center of global trade, power, and competition, and this shift is happening faster than most governments, corporations, and military planners are prepared to admit. For centuries, ice made the Arctic irrelevant to commerce, locking vast oceans, coastlines, and seabeds out of the global system, but climate change has broken that barrier, not gradually but decisively, reducing summer sea ice by more than 40% since 1979 and opening navigable waters for longer periods each year, transforming what was once an impassable region into a functional maritime corridor. This matters because geography determines power, and the Arctic rewrites geography itself, offering shipping routes that are up to 40% shorter than traditional paths through the Suez Canal or around the Cape of Good Hope, cutting weeks off transit times between Asia, Europe, and North America. A container ship traveling from Shanghai to Rotterdam through the Arctic can save nearly 10 days compared to the Suez route, reducing fuel costs, insurance premiums, and exposure to geopolitical choke points like the Strait of Hormuz, Bab el-Mandeb, or the Malacca Strait. Whoever controls these Arctic routes will gain leverage over global trade flows worth trillions of dollars annually, and this reality has not been lost on the world's major powers. Russia moved first, reopening Soviet-era Arctic bases, deploying icebreakers, installing missile systems along its northern coast, and formally claiming control over the Northern Sea Route, a shipping lane that runs along Siberia and already carries millions of tons of cargo annually under Russian regulation. China, despite having no Arctic coastline, declared itself a near-Arctic state, invested billions in polar research, ice-capable vessels, and Arctic infrastructure, and framed the region as part of its Polar Silk Road, a strategic extension of its global trade ambitions. The United States, by contrast, spent decades treating the Arctic as a peripheral concern, relying on outdated icebreaking capacity, minimal infrastructure, and the assumption that international norms would prevent militarization, but that assumption no longer holds. The Arctic today is not governed by norms, it is governed by capability, and capability is shifting. Beneath the melting ice lie vast untapped resources, including an estimated 13% of the world's undiscovered oil and 30% of its undiscovered natural gas, along with critical minerals like rare earth elements, nickel, cobalt, and uranium, all essential for modern technology, energy systems, and military production. Control of Arctic trade routes is inseparable from control of Arctic resources because shipping lanes determine who can extract, transport, insure, and monetize those resources at scale. The Arctic is also a military domain, not only because of its resources but because it offers the shortest missile trajectories between nuclear powers, making it central to early warning systems, submarine patrols, and strategic deterrence. The Greenland-Iceland-United Kingdom gap, long a Cold War choke point for tracking Soviet submarines, is once again a focal point of naval strategy as Russian and increasingly Chinese vessels probe Atlantic access routes. Greenland itself sits at the heart of this transformation, positioned between North America and Europe, adjacent to emerging Arctic shipping lanes and rich in minerals that the global economy increasingly depends on. For the United States, control over Arctic routes is not about exploration or environmental research, it is about preserving global primacy in a world where trade no longer flows exclusively through channels Washington dominates. The post-World War II order was built on American naval supremacy over key sea lanes, from the Pacific to the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean, allowing the United States to act as both guarantor and gatekeeper of global commerce. The Arctic threatens that model by creating alternative routes that bypass traditional choke points and dilute American leverage unless the United States asserts influence there as well. This is why the Arctic is not a future issue but a present one, unfolding in real time as ice retreats, infrastructure expands, and military assets move north. Shipping companies are already testing Arctic routes, insurance firms are adjusting risk models, and governments are redrawing maps of strategic importance. What looks like environmental change is in fact geopolitical change, and those who move first will shape the rules, tolls, and security architecture of a new global transit system. The Arctic is breaking, and with it the old assumptions about how trade moves, how power is exercised, and where the next great contest between states will be decided. The question now is not whether Arctic trade routes will matter, but who will control them, and the answer will shape the global balance of power for decades. Control does not mean ownership in a legal sense, it means the ability to regulate access, provide security, enforce standards, and extract economic and political value from transit. And in this competition, Russia currently holds the strongest position, with more than 40 icebreakers, including nuclear-powered vessels, Russia possesses the only fleet capable of guaranteeing year-round Arctic navigation, allowing it to escort commercial shipping, impose fees, and deny access under the guise of safety or regulation. Every ship using the northern sea route must currently notify Russian authorities, carry Russian pilots, and comply with Russian rules, giving Moscow leverage not just over trade but over the countries and companies that depend on those routes. China understands this leverage and has aligned itself with Russia out of necessity, using Arctic access to reduce reliance on routes controlled by the United States Navy, even as it invests in its own icebreaking and Arctic-capable fleet to reduce long-term dependence on Moscow. The United States finds itself at a strategic disadvantage, not because it lacks interest but because it lacks preparation. With a minimal icebreaker fleet, limited Arctic ports, and fragmented policy coordination across civilian, commercial, and military domains. This gap matters because Arctic trade is not neutral. It will reflect the priorities of whoever provides the infrastructure and security. If Russia and China set the rules, Arctic trade will operate on their terms, potentially excluding rivals, imposing political conditions, or weaponizing access during crises. From a US perspective, this is unacceptable, not because Arctic trade itself threatens American prosperity, but because losing influence over emerging trade routes erodes the structural advantages that have underpinned US power since 1945. The Arctic also intersects with alliance politics, particularly with Canada, Norway, Denmark, and Iceland, all of whom face pressure to balance economic opportunity with security concerns. Canada controls much of the Northwest Passage, another emerging route through Arctic waters, and disputes whether it constitutes internal waters or an international strait, a legal distinction with major implications for sovereignty and control. The United States has historically challenged Canada's claim to preserve freedom of navigation, but as Arctic traffic increases, Washington may find itself needing cooperation more than confrontation to counter Russian and Chinese influence. Denmark's role through Greenland is especially critical because Greenland offers not only geographic advantage but also political vulnerability, with a small population, limited defense capacity, and growing interest in independence that external powers can exploit. For the United States, supporting Arctic allies is not just about defense, it is about shaping a cooperative Arctic order that aligns with US interests rather than allowing a fragmented region to be dominated by authoritarian powers. This requires investment, not rhetoric, in icebreaking capacity, ports, communications, search and rescue, and environmental monitoring, all of which double as civilian infrastructure and strategic assets. It also requires recognizing that Arctic competition will not resemble traditional naval warfare but rather a blend of commerce, regulation, insurance, environmental standards, and legal frameworks where power is exercised subtly through rules rather than force. The Arctic will be governed by those who can make it functional, predictable, and profitable, and right now Russia is closest to achieving that position. For the United States, the challenge is not to militarize the Arctic aggressively but to avoid strategic absence, because absence creates vacuums, and vacuums are filled by those with fewer restraints. The Arctic is a test case for a changing world order where climate change accelerates geopolitical shifts, where infrastructure becomes power, and where trade routes determine influence as much as armies do. Whoever controls the new Arctic trade routes will not just move goods faster, they will shape supply chains, resource flows, and strategic alignments in a world already strained by competition and fragmentation. The breaking of Arctic ice is exposing not just new waters, but new fault lines in global power, and the decisions made now quietly, bureaucratically, and often unnoticed will determine whether the Arctic becomes another domain of contested order or a region dominated by a single set of interests. The Arctic is breaking, and in that breaking, the future of global trade and power is being decided.